Mike, we could just make a conversation.
Arkady will introduce us.
My speech only 5 minutes for beginning.
The microphone doesn't make any noise, but you have to speak into it for the recording.
Заходите, ребята, заходите.
So we have to hold these.
Don't cough.
Женя, где Женя у нас?
For some who work at Radio Free Liberty, I have.
Он будет записывать, нет?
Слышно? Да.
It doesn't actually make any noise.
А работает, да, или так меня слышно? Good evening, my name Arkady Yankovsky. I'm chief of this project embassy of all Russian deputies, Russian activists who are against Putin. Today, special day, because I remember about 1 year in the middle of October last year, we opened this project, this building. And first time I lived here and worked here, then half time in New York, I live in New York, and half time here. And now I'm here seldom, because we have beautiful manager, Yevgen Nemchenko, you know him. And I want to say, step by step, we move to the understanding what will be is Russia after Putin. I believe in Russia after Putin. We don't know when it will be, but we believe in it. And today, Professor Donald Jennings, former diplomat and professor of Johns Hopkins University, can explain us about his take his opinion. We will listen your opinion about future of Kremlin. And Mike will be moderator. I want to say, often we ask our speakers many other things, not about theme of lecture. And you can, you know. So all time you can drink, eat, and be active in our discussion. Thank you very much.
It works. This is just for the recording. 2 quick notes before we actually begin. We have a hard stop at 6:30, so this is going to be a little shorter than normal. So questions.
I'd probably be late for the concert.
Okay.
I'd hang over about 10 minutes.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But we're on a time crunch. So when we switch over to questions, be direct. We will be as direct as possible. I want to add 2 more little elements to the biographical description of our esteemed speaker today. Roughly speaking, he has 20 years of experience in the US government around Russia, and then another 20 years in academia around Russia. And in the greater Washington, D.C. area, there are probably 50 other people with a resume like that. What is special about our speaker is that he, and I mean this as the highest compliment I can pay, he is an absolute nerd. This is a guy who, when he was in Moscow in the 90s, collected newspapers and still has them. And so when he speaks, it's from a great depth of personal experience. And the question we all want the answer to is, what is happening in Russia, and when is it going to change?
Well, thank you. Good to see everybody, friends like Yulia.
Into the microphone.
I worked for Radio Liberty for a long time, and I still don't do the mic right. Is that okay? Nice to be here again. Nice to see friends like Yulia in the audience. Yes, so I was also a defender of the Russian White House during the coup. So I have a collection the size of this room about of newspapers and things like that. Most of you are younger than me here, but there was a time before social media, and when my last cable at Embassy Moscow in 1996 was a mapping of the Russian oligarchs. And there's something, Yulia, before your time called a floppy disk. And I had it all there about what did Khodorkovsky do, what does he own, what's his relationship. Because I was the guy in the embassy who wrote the cables about the rise of loans for shares, the oligarchs, and that the relationship with the United States was going off track in the 90s. And you know what? No one paid any attention to it. And I hate when people say they were right, but this time I was.
So you were there during the Yeltsin period, and you saw a lot of red flags
Yeah.
about what might come.
Yeah.
We know what came, and it's Putin. Describe what's happening in the system now.
You know, first of all, just to say, so we did not look at, for example, party money at all in 1989, 90, 91. And it turns out that this was important. And the rise of the oligarchs, the rise of, this gets to today, the rise of the oligarchs, the rise of CPSU money funding private businesses. No one really, even now, has written about it much. And I ran into, Yulia, you may know, I ran into Khrushchev on the metro in Moscow, tramway. And he looked at me with these big, and since I was there during the coup, he looked at me with these big glasses. This was right after Yeltsin pardoned him from prison. Can you hear me? So I introduced myself and said I was there during the putsch. He wanted to know about whether Yeltsin had asked asylum in the embassy, blah, blah, blah. But he turned to me and said, you must have a lot of questions. Really memorable, is this boring?
No, just to clarify, Khrushchev, was he head of the KGB?
He asked me when he walked off the metro, you must have other than my ego. Strobe Talbot and Clinton would not allow reporting analysis on non-reformers, meaning those who question shock therapy. And so I wrote it up, the meeting with Khrushchev anyway, my career on the line. And then since Strobe Talbot's book was called Khrushchev Remembers. Did I tell you the story? No.
You did.
Yeah, it was called Khrushchev Remembers. I called it Khrushchev Remembers, and I sent it back to Washington, expected to be recalled and fired. But Talbot and Clinton loved it, but they kept on with the reforms. So that shows you what value analysis has.
They kept on with the reforms.
Now, the shock therapy was held till relatively late in the game, in 96, 97, 98, even though the embassy, there's nobody from the State Department here, I hope, even though the embassy had been reporting, meaning Tom Graham and myself, that this was going off the rails very, very early. And I was a friend of Kuczynski, who ran the Mosbank empire, and we were reporting, because we were sitting there with Kuczynski, drinking vodka and getting calls from the Kremlin about what was going on, and we would go back to the embassy and they just said, no, he's not a reformer.
Talking about Putin.
About Kuczynski.
About Kuczynski.
Yeah, because the Putin thing becomes really the next stage of this development of the system. And if you're an American, how many Americans here? You're very institutional. You look at the world a certain way. Rule of law, international, rules-based international order, all that stuff. And then you don't realize that other countries care about culture and they care about history and see the world a different way, Ukraine being a primary one. And for Americans, this goes back to my talk here in June about negotiations. Americans think that for every problem, there's a solution. And Russians don't think that at all. In fact, and Americans think that if there's no solution, there must be no problem. And this is something that makes it very, very hard to function not only in the USG, where there's a certain paradigm, but also even in think tank land, which I do now. If you say certain things, they will say, what's your sources? You know, of course, Yeltsin's a reformer, or whatever it might be, and it's very, very frustrating. So you have to be on it all the time. So I am writing a major report now, as you know, Mike, on the hardliners around Putin, which I spend a great deal of time reading about, and writing, and I'm on TV. Since USIP, where I used to work, has been closed by Trump, I make some pin money on TV appearances, which pays for the wine, at least. I forgot your question.
I'm going to rephrase it, okay? You brought up Vladimir Gusinsky,
Yeah.
who in the 1990s was one of the major oligarchs. He owned a television network called NTV,
Yeah.
which was very critical of the Yeltsin government during the first Chechen War,
Yeah.
and which around the time Putin was coming to power, ran a pretty important investigative story called Razan Sugar
Yeah.
about the potential involvement of the FSB in the apartment bombings that brought Putin to power.
What a shock.
We're not going to go too deep into that.
That's your field.
In the 90s,
Yes.
in the 90s, you were meeting with Gusinsky.
Yeah.
By 2000, Gusinsky was being arrested and his television channel was being taken over. Now it is one of the most kind of comically pro-Putin federal channels there.
Yeah.
So
we would watch NTV every night, because it was NTV was the independent Russian channel. Of course, it was really never as independent as it seemed, but it was pretty good, and it was at least pluralistic. And I had a crush. I was single. I had a crush on Tatiana Mitkova. So we'd meet all these stars. The guy with the handsome guy, the big guy, was her co-host. You're too young to remember. On NTV, it was really exciting, and it was the new Russia, and it was going to be free. And I forgot what NTV stood for officially, but somebody said, no, it's not, doesn't mean independent, it's не государственное. And that's a big difference.
not non-state television.
Yes, non-state television, not independent TV. But if you're, this gets back to the coup, this gets back to the 90s, this gets back to what undergirds the Putin system today. If you see 91 as a democratic breakthrough, I keep looking at, we have these discussions. If you see 91 as a breakthrough for democracy, or a democratic breakthrough like Czech Republic or like Poland, then you had a paradigm about what was going on in Russia that was considerably different than if, like me, the minority, you did not see it as a democratic breakthrough, but that the collapse of the Soviet Union through a variety of forces, some of which were not democratic. And as you know, all of you here, there were a lot of semi-nationalist people who went from supporting Yeltsin to being vehemently anti-US 10 years later. And it was just a mix of forces that was not like the Czech Republic or Poland. But when you would go up to some people in the government or some very famous think tankers who you all read, it was always a democratic breakthrough, and thus a deviation from that became anti-reform. And you didn't see it in its complexity. That was extremely frustrating. So if you look at, if I'm speaking too much, I'm a professor, I grade papers a lot. If 91 was a democratic breakthrough and Russia's evolution since then is a deviation from that path, then you have a very different way of looking at Russia than you would if you're a rebel, question authority like I do. So if I can get into your end story here, I don't think the prospects for a democratic Russia ahead of us are very high. And that's, I think, partly because I see Russia a different way than a lot of people.
I want to get into where we are now.
Okay.
And I want to read a little description of the Putin system, and I want to get your reaction to it. Russian President Vladimir Putin is facing what is likely his most difficult and turbulent period in office. The Russian economy, in dire need of restructuring, is shrinking due to Western sanctions, and the inflation rate has risen to more than 10%. The country is plagued by corruption and bureaucracy and finds itself diplomatically isolated due to its invasion of Ukraine. Some top oligarchs have lost between 20 and 70% of their fortunes. In a system where money and political power are intertwined, this is a political blow to the regime. There is opposition to the war in Ukraine amongst Putin's wealthiest allies, prompting him to shrink his inner circle to a small group of hardliners from the power ministries. I'd like to get your reaction. How well does that summarize Russia
think that
today?
It's not bad.
Okay.
Did you write that?
No. Do you know who wrote that?
Who?
Donald Jensen.
I know, it sounded familiar.
In the Institute of Modern Russia, published on February 4th, 2015.
I was a child prodigy. I worked for, there was something called the IMR. Thank you for picking that up. I don't use semicolons anymore, though. I had a back and forth with Fyodor Lukyanov for VOA and then for IMR, which was paid for by Khodorkovsky. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I agree with that.
What's changed in the past 10 years, if anything?
What has changed is a number of things. First of all, whatever I said there, I still buy. It's a more authoritarian regime right now. I think the economic problems I mentioned are more acute now. I think Putin's authority is more authoritarian, and I think it's much more of a KGB state now than it was then. And then, of course, there's the Ukraine war. But I think those trends continue. This is a slight tangent, but on the same point. One of the things for an analyst here to have very, very most challenging thing is to track informal politics. If you read Telegram channels, which I do, you get a sense of the landscape. And if you study what Putin's relationship is, for example, to Kiriyenko or Duman or even the old guys, Patrushev, Naryshkin, you get a very different sense of how Russia works. And in many ways, how Russia is ruled remains the central question. And we don't understand it, really, as Westerners. We simply don't. So, yes, God, he's brilliant, but I think more and more even now than then. There are a number of things going on in the system now that are attention-getting. For example, the redistribution, again, of property among the elites. Putin's attempts to cultivate the children and grandchildren of the current blast, which is very, very interesting to watch. Putin's attempt, I think Putin's field of maneuver is to some extent narrower than it was. Depends on the issue. So there's a number of things going on. Putin's attempt to maybe welcome back war heroes, I use that in quotes, war heroes from the war, and give them an opportunity to rise to the system. Can I go to the Petrov thing?
Please do.
If anybody has seen this article or report by Nest 2 or 3 weeks ago.
This is Mikhail Khodorkovsky's new think tank.
Yeah, and actually Khodorkovsky does think tank, which is mostly in London, but is here too. Does a lot of really good work. If you haven't seen Transition Without a Successor, it's really quite good. It's like the girl with the curl in the nursery rhymes. When it's good, it's very, very good. And when it's bad, it's awful. And one of the things it's awful about, and I know him very well, is that the role of the intelligence services in the system is not even mentioned. And I don't think you can, this is a lot about public administration. If you know Nikolai Petrov, brilliant guy, good guy, I'm sure you've interviewed him on your program. She says knowingly. But you can't write, I need this back for a report I'm writing. Those are my old style tabs there. If you write a report on how Russia is ruled and talk about his argument centrally is Putin will likely remain in power and he's laying the ground for a transition of the system into something slightly different, but he remains the boss. I don't think you can write about Russia without mentioning the SVR, the FSB, and the GRU. I just don't think you could do that. And our own argument would be they remain the central organs of power in the system. Not the only ones, but the central, most important ones. And you can't write about Russian politics without doing that. And that's what I'm arguing. One reason you can't do that is because they are not just guys in epaulets. They are guys who are in businesses. There are guys in the Duma. There are guys in almost every field of the public life. It's infiltrated by these people. And they have a certain attitude. They have a certain modus operandi. And if you're talking about the future of the system, or you're dealing with whoever in Russia, if you're in the government, U.S. government, you just don't get it if you don't pay attention to that. Now look who's in town this week. Kirill Dmitriev, the business guy who's Putin's bagman, who dangles the shiny land commercial opportunities in front of Witkoff and the president and all that. He's there for a reason. And if you look at his background, there's a very clear KGB training there. The links are very clear if you know the pattern. So this stuff you're talking about how Russia is ruled and where the system is going, is, I think, critically misunderstood if you don't understand the role of the services. And that role is now, to answer your original question, I think bigger than it was then.
Okay, so what do the security services do in terms of ruling Russia?
Well, my professor at that institution in Cambridge, Massachusetts, named James Q. Wilson, was an expert on public policy. You probably heard of him. Expert on police behavior in the United States. There's agenda setting, there's decision making, and there's implementation. And for any given issue you might pick, let's say an energy deal, that goes usually before Putin. Putin decides, but there's very intense lobbying for various positions. And Putin doesn't always do what he wants to or feels like, or if he says something should happen, that sometimes doesn't. But those lobbies around the president of Russia are heavily populated by the intelligence services. If you go down a list of the top most it's allergies for me. It's not age, it's mileage. If you go down a list of the top lobbies in Russia, it is energy, it is all those things you might guess. And Fyodor Lukyanov, of all people, had a great article about 8 years ago how this works. But the intelligence services are clearly one of the most important because they have extraordinary military access, money, and are absolutely amoral. Now, I add another layer here, which is the issue of the clans. You know what the clans are? Clans are these fluid forming and reforming alliances between the KGB, that KGB in quotes, everybody, all of them, people in the government, sectoral leaders, so really determined, set the agenda, help Putin decide and determine whether something is implemented. And the KGB guys are central to this. For example, Sechin, our Sechin, has a group of commercial, military, and other connections that allow him to get what he wants, which is usually power status. That depends to a significant extent on Putin. But if you go down the major lobbies who float around the Kremlin, and then the clans who are alliances of lobbyists who get what they want, these people run the country. And in this network, the intelligence services are not the only player, but they're probably the most powerful. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. Is it fair to say that the intelligence services are a powerful institution in the Russian system?
I don't like the word institution,
Okay.
but they are an institution, but they're more than that because one of the key challenges for an outside observer is to get when do institutions matter and when do they not matter. And often it is Putin's friendship with Sechin or Putin's long-term relationships with people from the Ozora cooperative that make the difference. And those are not necessarily institutions. So if you look at the intelligence, I'm not this academic usually, but so forgive me. If you look at the intelligence services, they sometimes act as unitary actors. The FSB second directorate wants this. Sometimes parts of them, excuse me, the FSB wants this. Those tend to be security issues, things you would think about that they would normally do as an institution. There are subunits of that second directorate, or parts of the second directorate, who have commercial ties which are independent of what Vlast wants. And those are horizontal, those are enriching, those are always changing. And so if you want to understand, energy is the easy one. Who plays on an energy? Look at the affiliations and ties of those major actors, and it can actually be done with some reliability. I mean, I wouldn't footnote it all, but and you can tell. And so the FSB acts as a unitary actor. Parts of it act more horizontally, and then individual FSB leaders act to some extent that they can as individual business entrepreneurs, because ultimately Russia is a patrimonial state, which is money and power are blended, and that money, excuse me, money is not corruption is not a threat to the system, it is the system, and that's a very fundamentally different way of looking at it.
I want to read another little entry, but I promise this is not yours, okay? But I want to get your reaction to this one.
Could be make it from McFall or something.
So you can disagree. Dmitry Medvedev all but openly created a network of charities through which he receives bribes from oligarchs and builds palaces all across the country on a maniacal scale. He buys yachts and medieval castles abroad. Medvedev's schemes and the upkeep of his properties involve thousands of people. These secret palaces are guarded by the security services of the state. In essence, the secret is being kept from us, from you and me, from the Russian people whose money was used to build all of this. Not written by an American.
Did you write that?
I did not. But inside the centers of power itself, all of this is perfectly well known. Medvedev can steal so much so openly only because Putin does exactly the same thing on an even more massive scale. Everyone in the government can do it because the heads of the judiciary, of the prosecutor's office, and of the security services also do exactly the same thing. They become millionaires and billionaires thanks to corruption. You know who that was? That's Alexei Navalny, 2017, in his first, really big viral expose. Okay.
Absolutely. On the corruption thing, again, if you look at it as not a, can I say sexy story? That can offend anybody. I say not a sexy story. In this climate in Washington, I apologize in advance to anybody who's offended. I'm Italian, I can say that. Corruption is not just Al Capone in Chicago. Did anybody see Al Capone in Chicago? Corruption is an instrument of rule which Putin manipulates to keep loyalties, to benefit himself personally, to benefit his friends, and he allows others to do that. And one of the things Putin can do is, if he doesn't like you, Yulia, he can take away your yacht. And they better go check. And if he does like you, he can give you a bigger yacht. And this is a tool of governance. This is not a violation, as I said a moment ago, of the law. That's number one. Number two is that organized crime is effectively a lobby in Russia, and it's also a tool of implementation. So if you want to do something, and it's hard for the organs to do it, you can they do enlist organized crime groups to terrorize targets, to implement policy, to affect one clan battle or another in favor of whatever Putin might want. Why does this matter? I'll give you an example. How many here, raise your hands, kids, have heard about the horizontal escalation of Russia in Western Europe. Paris bombing, the terrorism in Estonia, Germany, the assassination of several characters in Western Europe. This is done by Kremlin decree, often through the agency of international crime organizations. Because once the war started, well, they've always done this, but it's increased lately, as I understand it. Once the war started and the West started to impose visa restrictions on the amount of people you could have undercover in an embassy. Let's take Rome. Russia got around it and expanded the horizontal attempts at terrorism in Europe by engaging organized crime guys to do what GRU guys used to do, but could no longer do because there's fewer slots in the embassy. And I know for a fact that the Russians recruit organized thugs from Serbia as well and send them to do various tasks. So these two kinds of things, corruption and organized crime, let's call it as a lobby, as a player, I think are very important to keep in mind. And we never look at that. How many times did any guy at a think tank where you get these free lunches, how many times do they talk about this stuff? They don't. And how can you understand all this if you don't see how it operates? I just simply don't get it.
So at home in Russia, where it's operating, there's the security services who have commercial interests in every aspect of the country. There is state-controlled media, which dominates the entire information space. There is a judicial system which might make independent decisions on politically unimportant cases, but anytime there is a verdict which the Kremlin needs, it only requires a phone call in order to get the right verdict. The election system is completely controlled by the Kremlin. Putin essentially chooses who his opponents are, and he counts votes. How
Does Putin control?
Okay.
And I'm a strong minority on this. I do not think Putin controls everything. Does Vlas at the top, can I share with you, at a big org, they understand everything that goes on below? No, of course not. In fact, often there's a disconnect, right, usually between street level policemen in the beat and the chief of police in D.C. That tension or that difference, I think, in Russia also affects how Putin governs. Henry Kissinger, in a book he wrote some time back, talked about the limits of a leader are the bureaucratic routines that make people in a large organization resist the top. They do what they want anyway. And I think that is a limit on Putin's power. There's nothing written about this, but I think that's a limit on Putin's power. So to talk about who controls what, that's like saying Russia controls 20% of the Ukrainian territory. No, they don't. They're there. That doesn't mean they control it. And in a country like Russia, which is so fascinatingly depressing and complicated, you have to pay attention to that. I interrupted you.
So Putin gets hit by an asteroid tonight. Yeah. What happens next?
Well. First, I'll give you a complicated answer. I'll give you a complicated set of observations without giving you an answer. Where's that paper? You'll see that Petrov, keep passing around. Petrov has a very, forgive a longish answer. Petrov argues a scenario which may happen, which is that Putin steps back a little bit. He puts the system on a authoritarianly reformed path. And it goes on with these young, corrupt people in charge, Juman and Kirienko. That's only one scenario, and that's the problem. If he's hit by an iceberg or truck, I think the differences among top players and clan leaders are very, very different. And they're hiding, they're pulling back only because I'm going to pass something else around, because they have to. And I don't doubt for a minute that a lot of Western involved big oligarchs don't like the war. They can't leave. I don't doubt for a minute that a lot of top brass in the Ministry of Defense are opposed to the war. I don't doubt it for a minute. I don't doubt for a minute that certain top siloviki leaders are against the war. They're holding back. But I think this will break out again if Putin dies unexpectedly. And successions are always difficult, going back to Stalin. And it's not just one thing. It's Putin dies, and there's a recalibration of lost in certain ways. Before I could, am I talking too much?
No.
Yevgeny
I want you to go.
Sveshchanov, one of my contacts in Moscow, was a former general in the KGB who advised Yeltsin, and he's had an interesting career. There, he talks about the strains in Russian society, and if some KGB guy is talking about the strains of Russian society, you pay attention to it. One is between the center and the regions. Our ambassador, you're from the heartland, Novosibirsk. But there are tensions, obvious tensions between the center and the periphery. There are tensions between new money and old money. Old money being the older generation of oligarchs, new money being some of the newly empowered guys. And there are tensions in a shrinking pie. There are tensions between those two groups as well. I'm simplifying. He goes into a great deal of authority, but there are also tensions between the MOD and the KGB. And those, I think, are regularly obvious. Number one, Prigozhin. Prigozhin was, experts in Washington argued for years about who was paying for Prigozhin. You know, because you know everything.
I don't know, but it was the Kremlin.
But Prigozhin had wide sympathy from the top of the general, Surovikin, wide sympathy from a lot of top-ranking generals. And go back to that fateful day. You're too young to remember. Go back to that June day. This guy goes through Prigozhin, the pograničniki of the FSB, goes south to Ryazan, steals a bunch of tanks, and then is having coffee with Surovikin. What is this? Because they didn't care.
Yevkurov and Alexeyev.
Yeah,
Surovikin got pulled off the front and put in front of a wall and had to make a statement that he was not comfortable.
And then he turns north on the highway and goes toward Moscow, and people are just waiting around. And this is what makes Russia great. It's very vulnerable to black swans. And this is what's going to happen if Putin falters.
Okay, I want to read another one of these.
Yeah.
Russia is likely on the threshold of serious changes that could occur at any moment, black swans, with or without sanction from the top. Putin is doubtless the key player, but he cannot do everything, and not all policies are his, as you talked about. The country is a complicated mechanism, but it is not monolithic, no matter what Putin or his critics might say about the power vertical. The interests of its clans do not always coincide, nor do those of the elite with those of the society at large. Elite and societal interests don't converge. Putin risks disturbing the system's equilibrium, which could be fatal for the regime and have very dangerous consequences for the country.
Who said that?
That was you in 2013.
What a smart guy. I still would say that.
Okay, we're 12 years on. What needs to change?
I write my famous baseball hobby. I think I remember what I wrote 3 years ago.
Of course not. Of course not. But
That needs to change.
in order for one of those black swan events to actually make a meaningful difference in the way the country is run.
If one of those black swan events happened, it most likely would lead to a split along the cleavages that General Sevastyanov mentions there. That, I think, is highly likely to be, I don't want to call it stable now, highly likely to be a further destabilizing event because the institutions are not particularly durable or strong. And a lot of people have guns. When I was also the only embassy guy who was there for the coup and then the shootout in '93. And it seemed like in October '93, it seemed like everybody had a Kalashnikov in their kitchen because all of a sudden there's people all over. You know, in Novi Arbat, there's those tall buildings. We're shooting at each other with Kalashnikov, a machine gun. I know, so I think that it would go down south pretty quickly, and pretty disturbingly. And beyond that, I will say, we talk about who might emerge, but I don't. So I would say it would not. You can't. Once it goes there, it's going to go. I thought under Prigozhin. I think we were close to that anyway.
I don't have this one on paper, but I'm going to paraphrase him. And this is a Michael McFaul, okay? Up until 2022, he would say fairly repeatedly in interviews that if you look at Russia's demographics, median income, median level of education, just overall general level of culture and well-being, it is much higher than you see in typical authoritarian countries. And he would say, I'm not predicting that there's going to be some kind of change next week. But he would say, if you look 20 years down the line, it seems far more likely that Russia will have become a more or less normal democratic country by then. Do you see any prospect for that at this moment?
No. Well, 10%.
Okay.
I am a political scientist. I'm a disgusted political scientist. Just because those demographic factors and socioeconomic factors are in play doesn't guarantee anything. Argentina has been described as almost a major power for 120 years.
It's the country of the future, and it always will be.
Yeah, there you go. And I just don't believe that's true. It's not that I'm rooting against Russia going in a benign direction. It's just that I don't see any indication that it will. And that means it's going to go in a Western direction. Who's going to drive this? And I know Karamazov very well, and I deeply admire his sacrifice. But to think that there's this little kernel of Joe Biden Democrats somewhere in Yakutia, and it's just not going to happen. Countries ebb and flow, countries zigzag, countries are determined by paths are determined by a lot of things, not all of which are microeconomic indicators.
I'm going to do one more of these, get your reaction to it.
Research for this?
I'm always doing research. And then I'll open it up to everybody else. Since Putin came to power, an almost unbelievably cynical collection of schemers and spies has acquired gold-plated lives that they know they stand to lose in the event that an adversary ever acquires the authority to take it all away from them. When Putin dies, it will be in the interest of each and every one of them to settle on an acceptable successor as quickly as possible. And, unless something unexpected happens between now and then, the next, in quotes, president of the Russian expect that if they fail to hang together, they will be hunted down separately.
Who wrote that? Don't make me guess. You wrote it.
I wrote it.
Yeah. First, you have to distinguish elite stuff from the society, and neither of which I'm particularly optimistic. see it. In a succession have guns. That's a very potentially scary, destabilizing situation. Now let's take, may I? Let's take the current flavor of the month, which is Sergei Kirienko, someone who, one of the people you mentioned, no doubt praised as the next president of Russia when he was a liberal prime minister in 1997.
He was actually on the dais when Putin was appointed as head of the FSB by Yeltsin. He introduces Putin when Putin is taking that job.
So Kirienko now, this has been one of the most interesting recent political developments, is that Kirienko, having become a really dominant player on the presidential administration, which is often ceremonial, but he's focused now on, he usually focuses on domestic politics, servicing the parties and so forth. But he, according to this riddle, is it Julia riddle? The source. Anyway, he made a play for Kozak's authority as the plenipotentiary to the Near Abroad. And so Dmitry Kozak, who was the initial negotiator with for Moscow at the beginning of the war, was basically fired, removed from his position because he opposes the war. And Kirienko, who's really a cynical, amoral individual, is now involved in foreign policy more than he was. He was the guy who had tried to bankroll, thank God unsuccessfully, the Moldovan election 3 weeks ago. And the Kremlin put about $200 million into defeating Sandu, and it didn't work. So I've not heard much of him since then, but he is widely seen as Putin's successor. If that's the case, then he will have to have buy-in from your friends. And I'm not sure that will happen.
Who are my friends?
Your friends would be the guys we talk about all the time. So I don't think Kirienko, who could be the next president without a buy-in from the three major organs. Juman, who's also highly talked about, often talked about, is Putin's former bodyguard, who's now head of the state council, and would be another one like that. But there could very well be a transition. Bortnikov has health problems, I understand.
We see the clock. We see the clock.
I can say,
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I'll stay for 10 more minutes.
And I
So I think, what am I thinking? You need a coalition. Go back and read, get the greatest Russia book ever written, which was How Russia is Ruled by Merle Frainsod, famous Harvard professor. If you haven't read it, read it. And it's thick and it's dense and it's brilliant. And what he says about the KGB then, 62, and succession holds right now. And that is to say, all these players will do their little games. In 53, Liberia went in the room, they shot him or poisoned him. In 64, Khrushchev came back and they got rid of him. So, you all know the story. And Yeltsin and Gorbachev, we know. So there will be some messy drama like that, I think. And I don't see how Kirienko can make it without buy-in from some big oligarchs and some big FSB guys. And in the case of Jensen, for example, they overlap.
I've got my money on somebody, but we'll talk about that later. Denis Mantrov.
That's all right. He's mentioned that.
Yeah.
You just want to be famous if you get it right.
Yeah.
The guys will be reading your stuff 10 years from now.
Exactly. I want to open this up. We've got about 10 minutes left, and
These
you've
are
been
my
great.
opinions only, please.
And I see a hand there. Talking to this just for the.
He's wearing a tie, too. Are you an oligarch?
I wish. I'm actually an intern. You talked a lot of You talked a little bit in the beginning about the identity question in Russia and how certain people view things differently than in the West. We're more institutionalized, whereas they, have different perspectives on questions. I'm writing my master's thesis right now about identities in Russia. To what extent do you think, while Russia obviously uses security services to control the population, they control the votes, they control the judiciary, all that kind of stuff, to what extent do they manipulate identity to control the Russian population? Like Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory, to what extent do the Russian oligarchs actually care about those sorts of notions? Or, are all of those sorts of theories and questions of identity just promulgated on the population for control?
Is it fair to ask how important is propaganda, and to what extent do the elites in the country actually believe in the messages that they're telling the population? So you brought up Dugin and his kind of theories. If you're, I'd like to expand it a little more to the general state propaganda, because just Dugin inside of Russia is not particularly influential or important. But there is this entire apparatus in the country which is controlled out of the Kremlin, which puts out everything that's on TV. They're also extremely involved in all sorts of online spheres. There is a Kremlin-controlled information ecosystem. To what extent do the people in power actually believe the messages that they're putting out to the population? Is that fair? Okay. To what extent do the people in power believe their own messages?
I'm making a joke. You are? Okay. I think that you have to differentiate the strategic culture and the worldview from individual commentary on issues and so forth. If you watch the reaction, which I do, to every Trump maneuver, you'll see instantaneous, tailored responses, clearly orchestrated, and there's a delay, they're taken by surprise. That, I think, is largely cynical, but some probably do believe it. Whether Simonyan believes it, I don't worry.
Simonyan is the head of Russia Today.
However, if you look at the general worldview, which is to say Russia should be a great power, it's a victim of the West, it's surrounded by enemies, the United States is responsible for this and the Brits and so forth, then I think that, and it's impressionistic, that is widely shared among certain elements of the harder line leaders. Definitely. How do I know that? Well, Patrushev and Narishkin actually write articles about this, and you can go online and find an article about Patrushev's worldview. And that, don't eat before you do that. So you can see that. So I think the general worldview, and one of the changes I would add to my quote is that the dominance of this worldview among the elite is much stronger now than it was in 2014. So the elite believes it, but does that always guide policy? Not necessarily. There's a difference between strategic culture and what you do on specific issues. So Yeltsin and Putin have very different views about Ukraine. That's true. But they still have the Russian strategic view that Russia is an empire and Ukraine ought to be under the influence of Russia. Does that make sense? There's a difference. And you as an American, or me as an American, we see certain things, rules-based international order. But that doesn't mean we always agree on policy. So I think that happens too. Mike is the Dugin expert. I won't comment on Dugin. But certainly that Dugin ideology, which was nothing 25 years ago, is percolated into various Lubyanka and MOD halls. The right-wing guy who wrote Zavtra,
Yeah.
he organized our meeting with Puchkov. So this propensity for crazy ideologies has been there a long time, but Putin really takes advantage of it Don't watch RT.
I
World
have
Series is on.
game one tonight. I want to get two more.
Yes, my name is David. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. What you described is something like we're not going to see a liberal democracy come out of Russia anytime in the near future, if ever. So my main question is, what do you think is the best outcome for what could happen after Putin leaves the stage? And what, if anything, should Western countries, Western powers try to do to bring about that outcome?
What's the best case scenario for life after Putin, and what can we actually do to help bring about that
You
scenario?
can, first of all, you beat them in Ukraine. So that and I don't mean negotiate and settle. I mean, you beat them in Ukraine. And we're not that far away, actually. The Russian, but you still have the problem of the Russian, I hate to generalize, the Russian mindset. And that has to be changed. Now, it changes and it has changed in many countries. Japan, Korea, great friend, great democracy. But how do you change that mindset? And I think that is partly done not just by tomahawks for Zelensky, but soft power. VOA, RFE, those organs are very, very important. And I'm not a simp by any means. What's that?
You mean the ones that are disappearing?
Yeah. When I was in Prague, I worked at RFE for a long time. When I was in Prague, I had a good friend from Bulgaria. And he said, well, Don, I would go to the embassy movie night on Friday, every Friday. And I would watch the Hollywood movies. He liked Ingrid Bergman. But every time they opened the door in the movie, there was always food. And the refrigerator, there was always food in it. He went, it's not like this in Bulgaria. That's soft power. And look how influential Italy is, or France, or Britain, Japan, for that reason. So we need a multifaceted. But first of all, be in Ukraine. And again, I don't think we're that far from it. Just push hard. I mean, one of the differences, interesting things is that you talk to a Ukrainian, and I do a lot. If you talk to a Ukrainian, you know what? The younger generation, meaning anybody really who's under 60, they talk just like they're Europeans. And you can't change that. And Russia is not even close to that level of transformation. And when you hear people like, forgive me, Navalny, make comments about Russia's imperial, because they have trouble controlling that. I don't know how to change that. Just stick to your guns, as they say, and be insistent. They're not like us. Somebody described to me recently, Russia's idea of happiness is overcoming unhappiness. That's a different way of looking at the world. And as I talked about when I was here about negotiations in June, you can't negotiate with Russia if they see negotiations very differently than we do. We believe in win-win. Russians believe in they win, you lose. And if you both have to lose, Russians want you to lose more than they lose. That's a very different attitude. And maybe сама жизнь диктует другой подход. Maybe life will change it, but for now, if they're not like us, that's fine. But just be aware that they're not like us. Because if you think they're going to be a little democracy, it's not likely to happen. So just deal with it. Be a big boy and girl. It's not. Some countries are not going to be a democracy within our lifetime.
Anybody else? Last one.
I would like to, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I would like to ask, if not Kirienko, who else? Because, Kirienko, of course, is a very trusted person by Putin, but not by patriots. Patriots consider Kirienko as an enemy. And I think looking at Kirienko as a possible future president of Russia, it's an illusion. It's not going to happen. So who else, if not Kirienko?
I agree with our questioner that Kirienko is an exceptionally unlikely next president of Russia.
I didn't say he was.
Right.
I didn't say he was probable. I said he's the current flavor of the month. I would say Duman has a much better chance. Duman, he is head of the state council, former Putin's bodyguard. He's punched all. Would you agree or not agree? But I would not bet anybody.
My money's on Mantrov.
Well, you'll learn. We'll have this conversation. Could be. But there are other people like Manturov who are good. That younger generation of about 40, 45, 50, because Medvedev will have drunk himself to death by then. That group there. But again, Putin is very nervous about it too. He doesn't want any war heroes coming back. And Manturov, I think, would happen. But you have to have that macho approach. You need ties in the military, you need ties in the security services. And if I didn't sense it earlier, the military and FSB are like this all the time. All the time. And that's a real weakness in the system. And you've got to get, I would guess, buy-in from both. That may, your only rise, that may require a more neutral, less controversial figure, maybe. But remember, I started my comment with saying I'm not going to predict anything except to say, let's all of us together tonight think about Russia in realistic ways and not pink ponies in the sky. It's not going to happen. And I hope I haven't offended. That's just what
I smell snacks, and there are sports on TV soon.
World Series, my college, thank you for understanding. And I will be back, I hope, soon.
Yeah. Great to see you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's go hang out.
Thank you. Good job. He's got a great TV voice.
Я говорю, ты хорошо приготовился. Спросить, как насчет Кирилла Дмитриева?
Что им?
Как со сексом?
Как преемник? Смешно. Хорошо, скажу почему.
Это скажи. Русский фамилия, это маловероятно. Так же, как здесь, еврей стал президентом. Какой бы он ни был. Поэтому Мантуров может играть какую-то влиятельную роль после того, как власть сменится. Но я не думаю, что он сразу главой государства. Потому что русские делают английское понимание. Они скажут, нам 20 лет вкалывали, что мы русские, самые великие и так далее. Какой-то мамка.
Я понимаю. Самый коррумпированный среди высокопоставленных сейчас. Мантров, он самый коррумпированный по уровню системы. Я вижу, как он смотрит на Путина и как Путин на него. Когда они выступают вместе, они понимают друг друга. Они понимают друг друга.
Это секрет. Но опять-таки, это не означает, что он станет.
Моя ставка на него, есть очень много.
Да, очень много. Я боюсь, что кто-то будет такой, которого мы не знаем.
Это тоже совершенно возможно.
Есть тоже такое довольно сильное мнение, что это будет кто-то из тех, кто вернулся с войны, кто там отличился, кто будет иметь большой авторитет. Его просто сначала поставили как Путин поставили как это все. Никто не думал, что он станет Путин. Он станет реально диктатором. Все думали, что его можно будет манипулировать. То же самое, выгнуть его, и то же самое Мантуров будет, я буду его крутить. А что дальше ты вернешься, кто знает. Как ты думаешь?
В конце концов, что-то будет. И
Что-то будет.
очень много
каждый раз жизнь преподносит сценарий, который мы можем пытаться угадать все, и когда приходит реальность, все оказывается не так, как мы думали. Я уважаю твое мнение, я буду думать, присматриваться, я слушаю, у меня выпадает, не изучал этого человека, я не знаю, что это представляет.
Голос очень странный. Очень странный. Голос странный. Ну, просто так.
Ну, там все угодно. Что имеет персонаж, наша администрация. Главное, дом разрушен.
Посмотрим. Мне надо кушать. Как дела? Извините.
You were very good at moderating. It's very engaging.
Let's go eat something. No, but he's coming on Tuesday.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I've never met him. No, he's. I'll send you. We're connected on the internet.
Yes.
I'll send you info, but he's going to be at some hotel not far from here on Tuesday,
All right.
10:30, 11 a.m.
Okay. All right. November 8th.
And the organizers want me to get people, so
Right. Are you helping organize?
no. But David Satter speaking.
Right.
Do you know Don
I've
Ritter?
heard of him.
Okay, David Satter